Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So hello everybody, and today our guest is the wonderful Fiona Agombar, who is a fantastically active, if that's not too ironic, rest activist. She's a yoga for fatigue expert and author of a really good book called Yoga Therapy for Fatigue, Stress and Burnout. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's fantastic to have you here. Now, I know that the idea of rest activism sounds really paradoxical, so I'd love you to open that up a bit and maybe talk about the quality of rest.
Okay, so why I use the term rest activist is because we live in a society which is the opposite of rest. It's very driven, and success is measured by what we achieve and what we're doing. And I think, if we're taking time out or taking rest, it's often viewed as something to be ashamed of. And we're encouraged to do more and more and more. And if we're unwell or fatigued, this is not helping us to recover in any way. So I'm all for promoting convalescence. I live in Spain now at the moment, so it's wonderful because siesta is actually part of the culture. So yes, for me, it's all about including rest as part of living, part of joy.
So rest then as an intrinsic aspect of day-to-day life. But what kind of quality of rest, Fiona? What goes into the kind of rest which is really restorative and healing?
Well, when I say rest, I actually mean lying down, preferably in the dark with no external stimulation. So that does not mean reading a book or listening to a podcast or even music. It means having a little bit of deep sensory deprivation, deep rest. I tell a story, a kind of anecdote, which is that a few years ago, there was quite a well-known professor who was treating people with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. And he advocated that if people rested for 40 minutes a day, 3 times a day, that they would get better. And this was actually happening. People were getting better. And I told my yoga group this on a retreat, and some of them got quite panicky at the idea of resting without including anything like reading or listening, because for so many of us, rest is still an activity that we do. So I mean rest is an activity where we don't do, it's about being rather than doing, and we're kind of letting go and undoing that mental idea of being.
So how do you then advise those, Fiona, who do feel that level of panic? Because I know for some people the experience of that kind of a slowing down and sensory close down can produce internal disruptions that can feel quite restless and uncomfortable. How do you advise people to handle that if that's them?
I think we have to work up to it slowly, maybe. I remember telling my stepdaughter that I was going on a silent retreat with my teacher. And again, she got very panicky and said, "Oh, silent? I couldn't possibly do that." Because you're right. Some people find the idea of being in silence and being still very, very threatening, because we're not used to being quiet. We're not used to being at home in our bodies. So therefore, we have to build up to it. The one exception to this is, I think, following something like a guided yoga nidra. And there are many free ones on YouTube, and there's a couple of free ones on my website too. Then that can be an offering. That can be something that can guide people towards stillness in a way that they might not find so scary. But it might well be something that we lead up to slowly. So we might be starting with guided meditation, guided relaxation, until we're more comfortable with being able to do this on our own.
So the guided yoga nidra takes you right into the body, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
So you're kind of going then for like the sensory, somatic aspects of experience, maybe feeling into the body as a way of using the body as a portal into a deeper kind of rest.
That's true, although to be completely accurate, something like a scanned mindfulness exercise is more of a somatic experience where we're in the body. The actual purpose of yoga nidra is to go beyond the body, so that you go around the body, but at some stage you're letting go of that, and then you are maybe at another almost subconscious level seeing that you are the body, but you're not the body. So I hope that doesn't sound too complicated, but it's a slightly different aim in yoga nidra. But in any case, both a mindfulness body scan and a yoga nidra can lead to a very deep state of relaxation and rest, which is very restorative too.
Yeah, so the body scan is often used therapeutically, isn't it? And I'm sure yoga nidra can be too. But what I'm hearing you point to a little bit there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea of then opening the body out as a field of awareness that goes beyond the boundaries of the body itself.
Yes, but I think we all have to start by actually connecting with the body first. And for some people, this is a real journey. And for many of us, we're in our heads and we kind of metaphorically live, 500 miles outside the body, and the head is not kind of engaged, or the mind is not engaged in the body at all. So it can be a slow journey of coming back into the body, feeling the body as a safe space. And again, this is not something that comes to all of us straight away, particularly if we've had trauma. So it's always advisable to maybe work with a trauma therapist or a yoga therapist. And then using somatic practices, grounding practices to actually be in the body. So it's almost that we have to do that before we can go beyond the body.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really getting at that thing that you were saying about kind of in the body, not in the body.
Yes.
The idea of the body, going into the body, and then the body becomes this portal to a wider kind of awareness.
I think the person for me that's described this most articulately is Eckhart Tolle in his wonderful The Power of Now. And for me, he was probably the first person who described this, and I go back to how he teaches this, because he talks about the pain body. And actually within the book, he gives what we would now see as a body scan. So he's talking about coming into the body and scanning through the body. And then he's explaining that if difficult emotions arise, we can really only release them by being in the body and observing them, and then being compassionately with them. So, lots of teachers and therapists do talk about this now, but I think Eckhart Tolle is one of the first to actually explain this in his body scan.
Yeah, and presencing is such a strong aspect of his approach to practice.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing there is this idea of compassionate presence to the self, and that the practical way of doing that is to be compassionately present to the body as a field of sensation.
We can't do this unless we are compassionate, because if we're not compassionate, what we tend to do is think, oh God, my mind's going too fast. Why is my mind going so fast? Why is my left knee hurting? Oh, I shouldn't have that pain in my shoulder. And we go into that small voice in the head, which is constantly criticizing us. So as we come into the body, the first thing we need to be able to do, and we might need guidance with this, is to have acceptance of how we are in the present moment. So we're observing how we are, and we're allowing everything to be as it is. And then we're trying to bring a sense of kindness to that. Just as if we were a small child, and we would be kind to a small child. So, this is how my body is, and everything's okay. Even if there's pain there or discomfort, it's okay, I'm allowing it. And then from allowance, we can maybe move to acceptance and then kindness. And then from that, maybe we can move to compassion, or even to a loving sense of holding ourselves. So it's kind of a bit like a ladder that we work through.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. So, Fiona, how do you teach people yourself? How do you approach this with people? I know you use gentle, non-invasive, non-demanding yoga practices. Can you give some examples for people who might be struggling with fatigue about how they could start this in a very gentle, practical way?
Well, how I teach is to either ask people to sit or lie. Some people are so fatigued they can't sit. And then I will start the practice with asking people just to observe their body, come into their body, which in itself might be quite unusual for people who are new to this. And then, just as I was explaining, asking them to observe and allow everything to be as there is, to allow their present moment experience, to witness their present moment experience, to not label it as good or bad, to bring this idea of non-judgment to their present moment experience. And then kind of will take them through being in the body. And then from that, I will usually go to the breath. And again, for some people, working with the breath can provoke anxiety if they've had trauma. If they're able to, we will start by looking at the breath. And that will be breathing through the nose, slowly from the diaphragm. And again, that might be something we're leading up to. And then if people would like to, because everything's always a choice, I might offer a little bit of mantra and sound. And then from that, I take people into a guided relaxation, because most of us don't know how to relax properly. So it helps if we can lie or sit and be guided into relaxation. And only when we've done all that, that's usually about 30 minutes, I then might move into very gentle movement if people are ready for it. So and then throughout the practice, I'll be bringing people back to the body and asking them to observe. So that, I'm reminding them, how is the breath? How is the body? Are you watching your body with compassion? Can you bring kindness to however you are in this moment?
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And so what's the track record here, Fiona, with this kind of approach? What have you seen in terms of how people start to heal?
I've never, I haven't got any kind of published data, but I do, I constantly have emails from people saying it's really, really helping them. I have a Facebook group which is called Restful Yoga for Fatigue with Fiona, and I think you're actually on it now, Anna.
I am,
and a lot of people there have been helped by yoga and are helping other people too. So it's quite an active group. So some people recover, and some people are just helped greatly. I mean, I think it's also helping people a lot with long COVID, because one of the main symptom of long COVID is fatigue. And what, the kind of two messages I want to get across to people with long COVID is you need to rest, you need to convalesce, and you need to learn to not hyperventilate and to breathe. So, if we catch somebody early enough, then we can help them to get better altogether.
Wonderful. So I know that you're passionate, Fiona, as well about the deeper aspects of yoga and the deeper aspects of fatigue as a way of more profoundly encountering the self and awakening spiritually. So I'd love to give you a chance to speak about that.
Thank you, Anna. Such a big subject. So for many people who practice yoga, who teach yoga, this is not so important. But for me as a teacher, it's always kind of been the one reason that I practiced yoga. And I think if I just kind of go back over my own experience, I became ill with ME around 1991, and I was profoundly ill for about 10 years. And then over a period of about 5 years, I recovered. But I went from being very angry and, hoping that conventional medicine would somehow give me a pill to make me better, to slowly realizing that wasn't going to happen. And then kind of going through a spiritual transformation, because I had to spend so much time in deep breath and relaxation in order to pace myself and to have any energy. This kind of led to a kind of spiritual awakening, I suppose you could say, because it became the inner journey rather than the external journey. And then about 3 years into my illness, I found an amazing yoga teacher called Angela Stevens. and she introduced me to the Yoga Sutras and this idea of spiritual inquiry. And the kind of basis of the yoga philosophy is that we have, I mean, in Western terms, we might call it the soul, but in Eastern terms, we'd call it the Atman or the self. And that the idea of the journey is to link this or to merge with Brahma or the universal life force energy. However you like to put it, it's a kind of, yoga means union. So it's a search, if you like. I mean, some of us might say it's a search for God. My yoga teacher talks about yoga being love, because love is union and love is connection, and yoga is about connection. So, as I say, this constant rest, and then it became meditation and spiritual inquiry became then the journey towards spiritual enlightenment. And from that, I've gone on, to study yoga with different teachers. I've also, along the way, studied Zen Buddhism and Vedanta, and spent a lot of time in meditation. So that's really been my journey. And then, that's something which I share with my students if they're interested. Not everybody is, but I find more and more people, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years where we've all been so challenged over the pandemic, more and more people are interested in looking for deeper meaning in life and what our society conventionally is offering us at the moment, which seems to be materialism, rush and consume.
Yeah,
so does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, it does, because it seems to me that illnesses around fatigue that force a slowdown, a drop in, and different levels of experience are remarkably powerful as ways also of opening up to spiritual growth. And for me, spirituality is about that inner journey. It's about doing that deep inner work. And as we do that inner work and we release the blocked up traumas and energies and all the rest of it, what starts to come up from underneath seems to be this gentle, blissful energy that is a form of awakened awareness. And we gradually start to realize that, in fact, that's who we are. We're not just these little thought patterns running around. We're not these emotions. We're not even our stories and our experiences. That we're something far more peaceful, far more still without being static. This beautiful sense of underlying awakeness, that which observes, as it were. And yeah, I think that journey, whether through yoga, meditation, or fatigue, seems to have some similarities and some staging posts and some ways of unfolding that really are radically profound in any human life.
I think you put that so beautifully. And what was also interesting is that you mentioned blockages and trauma. And my experience of both myself and through my teaching is that so many of us have trauma. In yoga, we refer to these as grunted, which means kind of like an energy block. And we may have had trauma going back to childhood. We might not even be aware that we have some form of trauma. But it's only when we start this process of being still that these blocks can start to arise. And quite often they'll arise as a very strong, intense emotion. And for most of us, we know that if our emotions are uncomfortable, then we've been taught to distract ourselves. So that might be overworking or shopping or watching television or drinking or, whatever the cultural norm is. But if we have fatigue, very often we can't use those cultural norms anymore. So we're having to face the emotion. We can't act it out. We can't project it onto someone. So if we are sitting still with it, it actually then is released. So it's kind of becomes like an emotion in motion. And it's as we start to release these trapped emotions that might be in our system from trauma, because the physical body at a very cellular level holds onto trauma, that's how we become free. And as you put very eloquently, there is something about us which is always present. So my Vedanta teacher used to refer to this as something which is ever present, ordinary, and always there. And different traditions call this different things. Buddhism calls it the no self, yoga calls it the self or the Atman. Christianity might refer to it as our inner Christ light or the light in the heart. But it's something in us which never changes. And it's there beneath the chatter of the ever-changing mind, between the thoughts which are always changing, the emotions which are always changing, like you say, the stories which are ever always changing. There is something ever present, and that is our true self. And it is a journey of self-inquiry to get there, but we need a lot of stillness, and maybe we need illness to point this out to us. So I'd be interested, Anna, to know your own story. So what was your story with?
Do you mean with the illness or spirituality?
Yeah, both.
Both. Okay, so I got horrendously unwell in about 1990 after a violent gastric flu. And being a type A personality, martial artist, child of the military, I kept pushing until my body just collapsed completely. And I then spent a grueling 2 years when I was more or less in bed all the time, having very intense experiences, incredibly intense experiences that were not at all comfortable, not at all comforting. And one particular experience that time was a radical, what they call, I now know people describe it as a Kundalini awakening. I had no idea what it was or what was happening, but I was meditating one day and had a very real experience of absolute darkness, and then a door opening, bright white light, a voice saying, "Come in." I then must have gone in the way that these things happen. And suddenly this energy just exploded from the base of my spine through the top of my head. And I actually had my Bible on my crossed legs at the time, which opened itself on the Song of Solomon, which is the ancient Judeo-Christian mystical text. So after that, I was never the same. I wasn't healed. If anything, things got worse. But the sensitivity that it felt like my skin was stripped off, honestly. I felt like there was no barrier between me and the world. And I had no one to guide me. I had no guru. I had no teacher. This was beyond the framework of my existing faith at the time, which was evangelical Christianity at the time. And that was the beginning of an extremely deep, long pathway. Looking back over my life, I had a mystical experience when I was 6, and I'd always had a deep sense of calling to the divine, or however you want to frame that. But that awakening experience was a pivot point at which my whole life changed. And then I started becoming a very serious meditator and doing lots and lots of inner work, including in psychotherapy. Very hard, facing all the the deep traumas of being born in a war zone and all sorts of stuff, which I won't get into because it involves other people, but very traumatic experiences in childhood and adulthood. And yes, an ongoing journey of unfolding. And I can honestly say that this is the point at which I become deeply, deeply grateful, actually, for the illness itself, which seemed to be like the opening of a portal to all of that. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened without it, but I do believe, Fiona, with all my heart, that I'm a different person to the person I would have been had I not experienced this.
Your story is quite similar to mine, and what I find interesting is many of the people I'm privileged to work with, have had similar experiences, and it seems to me more and more people are waking up. And like you say, illness is a portal. And I had a spiritual experience in Winchester Cathedral in 2010. So that was 20 years after my original illness. And like you, I then actually went through a dark night of the soul and had probably the most difficult 5 years of my life, 6 years of my life. But I know from the teachings that, I studied Vedanta and Zen, that actually this is because once you've had your awakening, it's your, what we call samskaras, or your patterns are coming up for you. You're acting out your stuff in order to actually see what your patterns are, what your conditioning is. And it's only as it kind of comes up that you then see that you're acting out your conditioning and what pain it's causing you. And then once you've seen it and you've seen the root of it, you can drop it. Because that's the way we become free, really, is to see our habits and our conditioning. And it is a very painful journey.
It is. And it's not cheap, is it? I mean, this is not a cheap version of spirituality where it's all kind of, and I'm not dissing anyone, but it's not about like being away with the fairies, as it were. Not that there's anything wrong with being away with fairies if that's what you do, but this is a deep inner journey through profound work that really calls for the best of your efforts, the focus, but paradoxically is all about letting go.
Paradoxically, it is about letting go.
Yes.
I think like you, as a child, I'd always been interested in this, but then had kind of drifted away, and then the illness brought me back. But my teacher at the time, Nadia Shanti, always says that this is not, the marketing sell for spirituality is it's all fluffy and gorgeous and angels and light. And it's not, like you said, it's hard graft.
Yeah.
You have to be very brave because you have to face your inner demons. And I remember being on a retreat with Adia when he said, well, enlightenment and awakening might not be for all of you here because you have to be prepared for great pain in letting go, because it's not this kind of new age fluffy stuff. It's very, very hard. It's very, very grueling. And unless you're prepared, don't feel bad if you're not ready to face it.
Yeah.
I think for me, like you, it had gone too far and I had no choice but to carry on through. And, still the unfolding continues. I'm not saying that I'm fully there yet. Still things come up for me to see. There's still a letting go process.
Yeah, well, I find every single time I meditate, something's drifting up through my system that I have to physically relax and let past, as it were.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This link between illness and this inner healing journey, and the idea of awakening to something far deeper. And I
wanted to actually on this idea that we have patterns that we need to release. I wanted to ask you a question because you mentioned type A personality.
Yes.
Which is something I've actually mentioned and I talk about in my book, and I'm interested in. And when I was originally teaching, I used to talk about people with ME having type A personalities. And then I realized that actually we live in a type A society.
Yes.
Which encourages that kind of behavior. But I wondered if you could explain to people listening what a type A personality is.
Well, I was very driven. So I was always pushing. And that was partly internalized drivers from childhood expectations, growing up in Catholicism and the military, a fairly hardcore combination of external authority structures. That was partly why I got so ill, because when I got the gastric flu, instead of convalescing, resting, as you said, I was thrown into bed for a couple of days feeling absolutely awful. But as soon as I had any fragment of energy, I was up pushing again. So that's how I think of a type A personality, someone who I was very achievement orientated, performative, driven by external assessments of who I was, very out of touch, I think, with my own deeper longings at a certain level. And it was just deeply counterproductive. And I think had I gone on from there to be completely physically fit, I was super fit before I got ill. I was martial arts training several times a week, pulling myself up a rope with just my arms. I mean, I was extraordinarily fit and agile. But the ME came as a massive interruption, a massive wake up, that even apart from the spiritual awakening would have redirected my life radically and the development of my character in a radically different direction. And as I said before, I'm deeply thankful for that.
It's interesting because I worry about people who have COVID, and we're seeing so many, I mean, it's more than 1 million people now in the UK alone with long COVID, because we live in a society where we're encouraged to be type A personalities, we're encouraged to achieve, to be driven. And of course, now we're talking about the cost of living crisis. So people who get COVID are not able to take the rest and convalescence they need. And I see people rushing back to work far too quickly, which is why they are then becoming chronically ill. So,
Absolutely.
you know, I do think we need to get this message across. I also, just listening to you talk, if I can recommend a book, because it kind of mirrors your experience and mine. So there's a wonderful book by the man who was my teacher, Adyashanti, and it's called The End of Your World. And it's if anyone's listening to this and they are listening to my experience and Anna's, and they think, well, that's me too. So Ady's book is about what happens if you have a spiritual experience. You know, what patterns and letting go you need to be looking for. And then his own experience, because he was also an athlete and was very driven. And then he got chronic fatigue. So he had ME for about 9 months. But then interestingly, and this is kind of the big warning in his book, he then went back to being driven again. And, you know, again, this is what I see with some of the people I work with, that we think we've learnt the lesson of our illness, but then that pattern creeps back in. That lesson of being driven and pushing and achieving creeps back in. And he got sick again. And the second time he got sick, he really did take that lesson on board, that this is a samskara or a pattern, a conditioning I need to let go of. So I just mentioned his book, The End of Your World, if anyone is relating to our stories, because it kind of mirrors what we're saying. Well, are you still... So I was going to say, are you still a born again Christian, Anna? Or
no.
Where are you at with that?
I wouldn't describe myself in that way. I don't use labels, actually. I feel that labels are unhelpful, and I haven't aligned myself with any particular position really now, and I'm very comfortable with multiple worldviews. I don't feel a need to choose between them in that sense.
Yes.
It seems to me that those who are drawn to spirituality and mysticism, there are commonalities across different traditions. Where they disagree, it seems to be more around the actual construction of the worldview, the dogma, the stories, if you like, the different stories. And actually having multiple stories, I think, is a helpful thing. You know, humans are too interesting and spirituality is too vast to tie down to any one story, I think. So not, but coming back to what you were saying there, Fiona, the combination of like a society that gets us to internalize these drivers, this type A society, as you describe it, and the need to wake up and actually, in some sense, step away from that dynamic in order to be healthy. I mean, it's a society that is, you know, anti-health in a very profound way, raises the question of what we do collectively, because it's very easy for us to individualize this in a way that makes individuals responsible for everything that happens to them. And there's obviously, we've got individual responsibility for how we respond. But the reality is the social structures that we live in make it impossible for some people to choose a healthy life. If they're socioeconomically crushed and they have to do, 3 jobs to keep their families going, they don't have much choice, actually. And so what we're saying now really points to the need for us as a community, and a community of people dealing with fatigue and having these awarenesses, to actually start thinking about ways that we could push back collectively, where our experience becomes a meaningful voice into broader society. And I don't actually know how to go about that. I love the idea of rest activism. I think that has potential implications, but we really need to nail our colours to the mast here, and actually really acknowledge the extent to which the neoliberal capitalist order makes it structurally impossible for some people to actually look after themselves at all. And that's a profound injustice. And I think we need to name it as such.
Well named, Anna. Well named. I don't know the solution, but like you, I think we do need to push back, because it seems to me that the neoliberalism WF agenda has got more of a hold in the last 2 years, but there is pushback, I believe, because I think more and more people are seeing through it. I mean, in some ways that's bad, because we're now seeing a very divided world. But, I think there are people beginning to set up smaller communities. They're growing their own food. They're trying to disengage more from that model of the world. I've come to Spain and I live in a smaller community, and I make it a point to not engage with the news, because I think the news has its own agenda and it's very negative. So, I do my best to protect my mental health by inputting positive things. I mean, we all have to engage to some extent in the system, in as much as we have bank accounts, or maybe we have mortgages, and maybe we're not in the situation I am in, where we can move to somewhere like Spain, into a different community. But, I think we can all do little bits, like I say, by growing our own food, by maybe not engaging in the news, by just guarding our sense of self. We are seeing more and more communities coming together. So I think there are green shoots of hope out there.
No, I would agree with that. I think there are signs of hope all over the planet, but I still think the system still locks so many people in who wouldn't have the energy to grow their own food, wouldn't have the time, wouldn't be able to drop out of the system in that way. And I think it's really important for us, when we think about fatigue, to think about those collective ways in which our fatigue also arises from these structures, and to think about planetary fatigue and human fatigue, and how that's all entangled, and the implications of that for the future. Now, a lot of people are going to be too tired to even think about that, and that's fair enough. But I think for those of us that do feel very strongly that there's a collective dimension to this, it's a real invitation at this point, I think, of the 21st century, to start thinking about what it is that fatigue and our journeys and our collective journey, the collective story that emerges out of our individual stories and is bigger than us, is actually speaking back into the 21st century. What is it that we need to reflect on, contemplate, and possibly articulate? I don't have the answers, but it seems to me that these go on. I was just going to say, I don't have the answers.
I was going to say, on a positive note, we're recording this in January 2023. Very recently, there's been a Women's Hour programme in which it included a feature on the need to rest. And the link for that, somebody has kindly posted on my Facebook group, Restful Yoga for Fatigue. So it is becoming a little bit more mainstream. I think that, again, those green shoots are out there. Yeah. There's a writer called Claudia Hammond who's done a book on rest. It's happening. It's slowly, but people are beginning to question it. And I don't have all the answers, but just by people questioning things and seeing that there might be a different way, maybe I think it's down to our education really to change, isn't it? But where do we start?
I think
conversations like this, maybe
absolutely. And the questions themselves. I mean, this folds back actually, and it'll be a good place to stop soon, but this folds back into our whole conversation about fatigue, because very often individuals with fatigue do not have the answers, do not know the way forward, and are in that stage where, they're kind of stuck. They're trying lots of different things. Nothing seems to work. We've all been there. It's horrible. We know it really well. But sometimes it's the questions we need to find, and we need to find the right questions and better questions. Whether we do that collectively or individually, there's something here about being willing to not have the answers, to not know, and to ask better questions. And to me, that's also the invitation to let go of expectations. It comes right back to the practice of letting go and allowing those questions to arise whether individually or collectively. And I think that's as far as I've got with it. I don't have answers, but I want to develop better, more penetrating questions.
And maybe educating our younger generation that it is okay to rest, that we do need to convalesce, that we don't need to achieve and push all the time. Yeah, you know, and that might be for parents and mothers to examine. But like you, I don't have the answers. But I think we have to be positive.
I agree. And there's something fundamental there about understanding what it is to be a human being, isn't it? To understand the needs of the body as the body, and the person as a person, and all of that stuff that comes into what you're saying about rest. It should be a fundamental right to rest.
And that we're not machines working for big corporations who then burn out at the end because we've just given everything to the corporation.
Absolutely. So, you know, critique of these big structures in society and these radical acts of rest activism and spiritual emergence and, you know, the journey from fatigue all come together in very interesting ways. Fiona, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really appreciated it and having you here.
Thank you so much for asking me, Anna. I've really enjoyed talking to you and sharing, you know, similar stories with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'm sure we'll chat again.
Thank you.